Thank you very much, folks. Much appreciated for the opportunity to be here with you today. Uh, as I said, my name is Kevin Whinnery, and I have the privilege of working on something called TwilioQuest, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But number one, I just wanted to say the universe programming lineup has been amazing so far. Cassidy gave us a great intro to some of what I think are the important bits of how to think about yourself as a teacher, even if you're not an expert. And Emoju's talk about how knowledge is acquired as a software engineer is some of the best advice that you can get early in your career. Certainly the mistake I made as being sort of a passive good student back in the day was to assume that all the information I would need to be successful would be like transmitted to me by teachers, and then I would turn around and solve like neatly structured problems. But that's really not how software engineering works, at least not, interesting software engineering. You typically start with a problem that's big and scary that you don't understand, and you need to acquire the knowledge that you need to be able to solve that problem. So Emoju's talk about how you acquire that knowledge was really great to hear yesterday. So in the spirit of Cassidy's talk about teaching something that you are just learning yourself, I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about game design and the game design stack, which is a very useful construct that I came across on my journey to developing a game. So yes, my name is Kevin. You can find me on social media here at Kevin Whinnery. I'm on GitHub at kwhinnery. Unlike some of the other presenters, I've been less stringent about making sure I have the same handle on all those social platforms, but I would love to hear from you on any of those channels. And where my journey and our journey starts today is way back at that sort of what I would argue is the pinnacle of video game design. In the 1990s, there was a space flight simulator called TIE Fighter, which would put you in the cockpit of a TIE fighter, a starfighter in the Star Wars universe. You would fly around blasting X-Wings and Y-Wings. And to young Kevin back in those days, it was the greatest thing that ever existed. And in learning how to play TIE Fighter, I first had to learn how computers worked, because if I can get back on the back in my day horse, back in my day, computers didn't just run the games you wanted them to run. I had to figure out like how to upgrade the RAM in my computer. I had to figure out how to create a boot disk and like boot a program from DOS, and how to like execute commands in order to make this game actually appear on the screen. So not only was it one of my first like formative video game experiences, it was also one of the things that made me want to get into technology and sort of pushed me into that world and made me realize like what was possible. And even back in those days when I was playing TIE Fighter sort of passively, I thought, man, this is really what I want to do. I want to be a video game developer. That's how I'm going to spend my career. It's going to be great. But well-laid plans often don't work out. My backup plan was to be an NFL quarterback, which also didn't work out. So where I ended up was building websites, which was super fun. And even better, I got to start working with developer communities. I became a developer evangelist. I worked on documentation for developers, and with Twilio and other companies before. My job was to make developers successful. And one of the things that I tried to do in that vein was to make learning Twilio, or the Twilio API, a little bit more fun. So back in 2013, over a week of sort of fevered hacking on AngularJS 1.0, I created kind of a gamified tutorial for Twilio that I called TwilioQuest. And being the huge dork that I am, I thought like, oh, it would be fun if, as you're going through tutorials, you gained experience points and you got like items that you can equip on your avatar. And I thought it would be fun. But what I didn't understand at that time was that these progression mechanisms and these gameplay mechanisms were the carrot that a lot of folks needed to like keep making progress in a field of study, in a field that is generally defined by frustration. So making that experience fun and using gameplay ended up being a really important tool for educating folks and getting them to understand harder technical concepts. And when we saw that developers actually really enjoyed learning in this way, we said like, all right, we're going to push in our chips and we're going to really say like, all right, TwilioQuest, we are going to make into a game, not just sort of a fun tutorial system, but we are going to try to make a, honest to gosh, PC game that we hope will be intrinsically fun. That's going to actually teach these programming skills. And further, we don't necessarily want it to be focused on Twilio. We want to teach folks how to use the command line. We want to teach folks how to install Python on their computer, how to use command line tools like Git, and actually start to use their computer like a developer. And that's kind of where we've ended up with TwilioQuest, which I think some of you have had a chance to check out already. We're still very early in the journey with this software, but we feel pretty good about how far we've come in a relatively short amount of time, and we hope that you've had a good time playing it. But when we kind of decided to make this decision and make the jump and say like, all right, we are making a video game, there was a problem. And that problem was I had no idea how to actually make a video game. I'd had lots of practice with video games by playing them myself, but I didn't actually know what it took to design a video game. Like I didn't really even know how to think about it. So I started to kind of look around for frameworks and ideas about like how to organize your thoughts when you look at the process of building a video game. And one of the tools that I came across one year I actually got to go to the game developer conference back before the fall of human civilization when we could still do live events. I went to San Francisco and I went to a talk from a panel of great game developers. And this was one of the things that really stuck to me and helped me think about what TwilioQuest was really about. So for the prospective game designers among you, I thought I would share this conceptual framework for you to think about how a game works and also how to make decisions about where to invest your time. For most of us, we don't have unlimited time and resources, so we really need to focus on what's important. And the different elements of your game's design are all have the capacity to be really impactful and important. But really, you have to make some tough decisions about where to anchor your experience and where you're going to invest your time. So in the game design stack, I'm going to kind of talk about it from the bottom up, and hopefully it will become clear why as we go. But sort of the bedrock of a video game and kind of the thing which distinguishes it from other media is the concept of a fantasy. In a video game, you can put the player in the shoes of someone or something else. And that's, you can try to do that with prose in a book. You can try to do that with imagery in a film. But through a video game, like you have the superpower of being able to tap into human empathy and literally put somebody in someone else's shoes. Empathy is like the graphics API by which you will render your game into the hearts and imaginations of the folks who play it. So, thinking through what is the person or the thing that you want to transport your player into is a really useful place to start when you're thinking about what your game is about. And one good example of this is the recent Spider-Man game on PS4, is where I recently played it. And more than any game I played in a really long time, I was the entire time just like, yeah, I'm Spider-Man. I'm out here doing Spider-Man stuff. I'm flipping around buildings. My cell phone is blowing up. And it's my aunt or my boss who's telling me I'm late for work. And the ways in which they weaved all the elements of that game together to create the illusion that you were Spider-Man was really first rate. So that's an example of how you create a fantasy and create that empathy within a game world. After that, you start to construct the action. And the action of a game is just the stuff that you do. What are the players actually going to accomplish while they're playing the game? And one example of a game that's sort of anchored in action is something like a sports game, like Madden, where there isn't a lot of story, there isn't a lot of narrative potentially around the gameplay. It's really about doing the thing. It's about making a pass. Or a first-person shooter or something is another game that's very rooted in action. And the economy is basically the set of rewards for the actions that you undertake within the game. So you successfully slay a dragon. What happens afterwards? What do you get? And what can you do kind of with the currency or the points or the other things that you earn while you're in the game. And there are some games that are actually just economy. So like something like a farm simulator, there is no real gameplay element other than managing the economy of your character and the other rewards that you're getting through the systems of the game. And these elements exist in some kind of game world. So the world is the story that you tell with the environment in which you place the player. And just by using space, you can convey a lot of information that you'd have to burn a lot of books or a lot of words in a book in order to convey the same sense of world that you can do in a video game. And I think a great recent example of this is like the Breath of the Wild. If you've played the most recent entry in the Legend of Zelda franchise, where the story of the game is actually not super interesting, right? Like the dialogue is pretty stilted. It's a pretty generic adventure story, but like where the game really comes to life is in how cohesive the world is. And that's where you start to like see the real story and the real, imagery of the game really pop out. You explore the ruins of a castle town that was decimated by walking robots. And you feel, at least for me, I felt in the pit of my stomach, the remorse of like this town that was so clearly like torn apart by this, by these terrible robots. And that is where it really exposes the texture of the world to you, is in the environments that you explore, the fact that you can go anywhere and do anything. So world ends up being a really powerful component of design in that sense. And then finally, we have the story. So this is the reason why things are happening in your game. And for some games, story is everything. It's the primary component. And for some, it's barely necessary. But every game has to have something of that nature. You are here for some kind of reason, and this is the thing that you are doing to accomplish that goal. And some of the games from Supergiant Games, Transistor is the screenshot that's up on the screen right now. Story is a critical element of what makes those experiences successful. It's the thing that propels the player forward and convinces them that this is an experience worth having. So these are kind of the if you can describe a game's fantasy, the action, the economy, the world, the story, then this is like the conceptual framework that you can use to describe your game to someone else. And it becomes kind of the guiding star for your own design and development process, because you can understand like, all right, what are these things supposed to be in the game? Like, what is the most important? Like, which of these elements is really central to making this game a great experience? So to help try to apply these concepts, I'm going to need some help in chat. What we are going to do is come up with a brand new video game concept, and we'll try to explore some of these areas for that new video game concept. So the first thing that I'm going to ask chat to come up with is, what is a fantasy that could underpin a video game? Like, what's an idea of a place that you could put a player in, or a role you could put a player in that would be something that they had never experienced before, or something that you would want them to experience for the first time in first person through the eyes of a character that's actually experiencing those things. So I'm going to head over to the chat and see what we come up with. Like, what would be a good fantasy to include, for a potential video game? So I see some stuff coming in. I saw Dragon Slayer come in briefly. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay. That's actually a great one. So scuba diving. Somebody came up with like a scuba diver. It's like, and that is the thing that you want to experience in the first person. And swimming generally and being underwater is a great space to explore. Like Subnautica is a really great VR game that explored those themes really effectively, I think. So let's start with there. So this game, the central fantasy of the game is going to be you are a scuba diver. Now, with that fantasy in mind, like, what are the actions that could happen in such a game? Like, if you're a scuba diver, what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to spend your day? Like, what's the stuff that happens to you? What are the things that you're going to do in this scuba diver fantasy? Um, I also see like a water dragon slayer, perhaps like that. That's a great idea. We could combine the two, scuba diving, dragon slayer. I dig it. Uh, so I'm seeing some stuff come in like explore underwater ruins, managing oxygen. Exactly, like that's a fantastic idea. You have to understand like oxygen levels or pressure. You have to refill your tank, eat a fish. These are great examples of different actions that you could take within a scuba diving game. Now, I imagine you'll know what's next. So, what could an economy look like? Like, how could you be rewarded for taking some of those actions? What would you do with those rewards? Like, what is a meaningful thing to get rewarded with? Like after you accomplish all of your scuba diving, dragon slaying tasks. Um, so you could get find exotic fish. That's another good action. Um, but there's things like you could there we go, seashell economy was the first one I saw. Scroll up. You could find ancient artifacts, right? You could upgrade your tools. You could sell treasure that you find under the ocean. Y'all are doing great. I think there are some game designers here in the chat today. So that's a little bit about the economy. And in the interest of time, like we won't go all the way maybe up the stack, but you can imagine for the world, one of the things that Subnautica does really well is it imagines a planet that's completely covered by ocean. So swimming and underwater stuff is happening all the time. Like you barely are ever above the water. And that creates a world where swimming and survival under the water really becomes a central theme of the game and really provides a different type of experience for the player. And the story could be anything from, you are an underwater dragon slayer and you need to find a dragon somewhere and defeat it with the tools and the other stuff that you can buy with your seashell dollars or whatever the economic system happens to be in the game. So now we start to have like a design document, a way that we can understand how our game is going to work. And now finally, we can start to talk about why it's a stack and why we have arranged these things the way that we have. And the reason for this being a stack is because these items are sort of arranged in order of things that are easy to change down to things that are very, very hard to change. So now imagine that instead of the fantasy of scuba diving, of swimming underwater, existing underwater, we replace that with, you're a bird, right? Or you're an angel soaring above the clouds. Well, that just destroys everything else, right? Because the actions that you are going to take are completely different. The economic systems are completely different. The world setting no longer makes sense, and the story is probably also going to be incredibly difficult. Whereas some of the other elements higher up the stack are pretty malleable, and they can change to serve the other items that are beneath it. So one of the great stories that I've heard about this is in the early days of video game development, there was a team going through a process of creating a game that was like a top-down shooter, like a Galaga or Raiden type like arcade game where you're flying a spaceship around Earth and you're blasting these alien spaceships. And the people who are kind of creating the story and the world around this game were like, okay, this is happening like pretty high up above the Earth. So we're going to need clouds. We need clouds to like filter across and float above and underneath the player's spaceship. And given the technology restrictions that were available to the developers at the time, the developers took a couple of days. They tried a few things out and they were like, okay, you can have clouds, but they have to be green because of just bizarre limitations of the technology platform that they were targeting at the time. And then the designers were like, well, clouds aren't green. This is Earth. Like, this doesn't make any sense. But then they were like, well, maybe the aliens attacked Earth with chemical weapons, and now there's these clouds of green gas that are everywhere. And just by kind of thinking and flipping the way that they thought about the story, they could make these other elements of the world and the action work. So as you're kind of going through and designing a game, having a sense of like what kind of changes are expensive to make and what kind of changes are a little cheaper and a little more flexible, get to be really important concepts to understand as you're making those tough choices. And when we applied these ideas to TwilioQuest, we had to think about all right, where is this game really anchored? Like, what's most important about this experience? And where we came to was it was really about the action, the experience of encountering a puzzle that required applying technical skill, entering, writing some code to solve that puzzle, and that loop of actually executing the code tasks. That action was much more important than anything else in the game. And with limited resources, initially just me, and later other intrepid souls that have joined the team have been a huge boon to getting the game to where it is today, we still have to apply that same focus and keep in mind, all right, what is really most important, and make some hard decisions and trade-offs based on those things that we have to deliver. So when we did that thought exercise for TwilioQuest, the things that became important were content. So we needed lots of different types of challenges that you could encounter in the game. We wanted to be able to teach things like version control to Python development to everything in between. So the ability to teach lots of different concepts is super important. And because content was so important, content authoring was also something that was really important. So we had to invest in tools to actually create, a breadth of content within the game. Because if we just had, 6 or 7 objectives, that really wouldn't work. So those are some areas where we had to invest. The other thing that this really drove was the reason why TwilioQuest is a PC game that runs on your desktop rather than a website. Or a web application that you visit in the browser, because in order to teach people how to use the tools of software development, like how to use commands from the terminal, or check that you have a local development environment set up, and help guide people through that process, our validation code really needed to be running on the computer of the developer. So that was one of the reasons why TwilioQuest is a PC game, and we'll talk a little bit about the technology here in a minute. And we also knew that what was important was the narrative and level design of the content. Like, the core reason why TwilioQuest worked for education and technical instruction was the carrots that we were able to provide of narrative. Like, there's a locked door, and all of us just have an instinct to want to be able to get past that locked door to the next thing. Just being able to put the player in 2D space and lay a path out in front of them where they understand, if I keep going, then there's another thing for me to do over here. There's another chest for me to unlock over there. And just making that change, compelled players to experience way more of the game and do way more of the tutorial content than they did when we were just a browser-based tutorial website. So these are the things that we had to focus on that really mattered. And then some of the things that ended up mattering a little less, or the things that we didn't invest as much time in, this one really broke my heart, which is we haven't focused as much on world building, storytelling, exposition. I assure you, I have, probably 50 pages of Google Docs of the lore and history of the TwilioQuest universe that who knows if anybody will ever experience it. But at the end of the day, it's just not as important as getting that educational content out there. One day I hope to incorporate it, but we'll see how that goes. The XP and the loot economy were important, they were part of the motivation. But what we saw after we deployed the first version of TwilioQuest is what really got people going was progression. They saw a corridor with locked doors, and they saw places and nooks and crannies to explore. And in our user testing, we saw that was really the thing that drove people to action. So how many points you scored and the loot that you acquire is fun. And I think people have really liked that, but it hasn't driven behavior in the same way that progression does. And also RPG staples like combat and the vendors and stuff like that. Those are things that we want to incorporate in time, and I think that eventually we will. But again, it turns out that they weren't necessary to make the experience what it is. So, as you're thinking about taking on a game project, number one, my advice to you would be to keep it small, to try to focus on one nugget of something excellent in the experience of a game and then focus on building that. Like Doodle Jump is a incredibly successful game, and it has like 2 buttons and probably the simplest controls you could imagine. So just try to find that one nugget of something cool, whether it's a story or an element of world building or an economic system that you think is really cool. Hone in on that one thing and decide where your experience is anchored and build around that. Because building a game is less like building a car than it is like packing a snowball. So you start with something very solid at the core, and then you can kind of pack things around it. And then eventually you end up with an experience that's pretty great. So what I'll close with is just a quick look inside the technology stack of TwilioQuest in case you're interested in trying this yourself with web development skills, which if you're like me, I didn't go to college and learn how to use Unity, although I did evaluate it for the TwilioQuest project. But the web development skill set I had meant that I could be more productive if I used those skills in building the game. Also, the fact that we lean so heavily on rich media and content is a great reason to use HTML and CSS in the presentation of the content, because we can have hyperlinks, we can create user interface with HTML and CSS, specifically using React, which ends up being a great advantage. So as we were kind of making these early decisions, we knew we wanted to be on the desktop. Web technology was going to be useful across a variety of vectors. And we knew that, our game would be highly reliant on user interface. So having a high-level UI library like React was going to be really useful to us as well. And then the way that TwilioQuest kind of works together is in the game window. It's an Electron desktop web application. And to define Electron a little better, some folks may have run into it before, but it's a desktop app framework that lets you package HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and ship it as a desktop application. So Visual Studio Code, the Slack desktop app, the Discord desktop app, all of those use Electron as the way to deliver that experience to the desktop. And that's what we use with TwilioQuest as well. And then within the game window, which is an HTML page, we have a WebGL canvas, which kind of sits behind everything. And that's where like the more gamey bits happen. We render like the player movement and sprites and like handle collisions and that sort of thing within a WebGL canvas. And those interactions are managed by a library called Phaser, which provides lots of great high-level APIs for doing animation, for rendering tile maps to the screen. We also use an open source tile map editor called Tiled to actually construct all the levels within TwilioQuest. It's an open source tool, which is great, and exports like map data as a JSON file that we can then work with in JavaScript. So it ended up being a really nice choice for us. And then on top of that WebGL canvas, where all the Phaser magic is happening, is a React web application. So everything that you're interacting with and clicking on is driven by React. And that's a major benefit that we have over, say, Unity, where in my experience and frankly, uneducated opinion, I found creating UI in Unity and in like game engines to actually be kind of tricky in comparison to building those same things with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So the ability to create user interface using web technologies actually ends up being an awesome technology choice for those reasons. So we talked about some of the pros and cons. A couple ones that we maybe didn't get to is as we look to have more developers contribute to TwilioQuest, and that's something that we're going to be very interested in the near future, choosing web technologies makes it easier for more people to contribute. Fewer people maybe know about Lua or Unity than know about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it ends up broadening the community of people who can contribute to the project. And then with Electron specifically, the fact that we have access to the whole universe of Node.js packages and the NPM ecosystem has been just a huge boon. Like, there are fewer and fewer problems these days that you can't solve with like NPM-I. So the access to the open source ecosystem of JavaScript has been a tremendous shot in the arm for our project. Some of the cons, obviously, like the performance of the game, especially on lower end hardware, is not yet where we want it to be. So like Electron itself is pretty heavy and then browser-based game engines are just not as performant as like their native counterparts, and that's just one of the trade-offs that you make working with web technologies. The other things that you'll notice is like the tooling for the gamey stuff, like for level design and sort of dragging and dropping, elements into a game environment. If you use tools like Unity or Game Maker Studio or other types of things, like you might be used to higher level tools that as a rule generally don't exist if you're doing game development for the web. And then this is probably the worst part of going to the desktop, which is packaging and distribution. So the TwilioQuest web app is something that we have to sort of package up as an Electron application and code sign and ship to everybody who plays the game because we wanted to distribute it independently. And it turns out that that's a bear. And it's among the gotchas. I'll maybe start with that one first because even though it's down at the bottom, is like, if you're distributing a desktop web application, doing it on your own and distributing independently outside the app stores is a massive undertaking and has shortened my life by at least 3 years. So if it's something that you can avoid, I would recommend doing it. Just kneeling to your corporate overlords and distributing through the app stores will probably save you a lot of time, unless it's a deal breaker for the experience you want to create. Some other things to be aware of, like the Electron userland packagers, which actually create those installable applications, are great. They actually are super slick in many ways. But if you have to kind of deviate from the happy path that they've created, it ends up being a little tricky. So we use lower level packaging tools and NPM scripts to build our distributable binaries that we actually ship to all of you. Another thing that you'll encounter if you're a React developer, you're probably used to using tools like Create React App, where there's like a local web server running that loads up your application over HTTP. That is great, and you can actually do that with Electron development as well, but there are subtle differences between loading resources from the file system via, versus HTTP. So always best to determine that your application also works like after you package it all up and there's not a web server running in the background. Also, just file system access and platform permissions across platforms. Actually, there's a bug we're working on right now. We had somebody who was participating in TwilioQuest and they had installed Git on their system, but we were not, like the game client wasn't able to detect it on their system path. So those issues continue to be tricky. Like we've invested a lot of hours in ironing those out, but those platform-specific gotchas, it's more relevant for TwilioQuest than it would be for other games, but definitely something to be aware of. So with that, I'm going to try to wrap it up and leave some time for questions and a little bit of a break before the next presentation. But I appreciate your time. I love talking about this stuff. I'm learning about it all the time. And I just have the privilege of being able to work on something that I really love and enjoy and want other people to love and enjoy it as well. And I hope that even if it's not games, that all of you, as you're starting your careers in software development, are working towards that goal, to work on something that you love, that you are able to pour your heart into and make people happy. And hopefully you will be able to do that. So thank you very much. And let's see if we have any questions.